I think the point is that you exclude the medium. It's not just that small is beautiful. I think we've proven ourselves very capable of creating luxury food economies, living inside of the rest of our food economy. We're pretty good at 1%. But if we wanted medium small and smallish medium to be able to occur, then we do maybe need to confront the big and the giant and the gargantuan who are, operating with profligacy in what is our shared waters. And I think that's a major part of what makes it different on the sea and then on the land, is that these waters do belong to all of us. It is a commons. It is in the public trust. So it's you could say it's a way to prototype some of the regulating that we need to do more on land, and some of the challenges to private property that we might realize soon that we will need to confront on land as we try to remediate and recover and respond to extreme climate change. We're going to have to be imposing more on everybody's, private property freedom to do as they like. And so I think maybe this is interesting in the way that it also helps us prototype that thinking.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish soil-grown crops and pasture-raised livestock under the organic seal. You just heard from Severine Von Tscharner Fleming. She's a farmer activist living in coastal Maine. Severine is really well known for co-founding the National Young Farmers Coalition and for creating a documentary about the young farming movement called the Greenhorns. Today she runs Smithereen Farm, a certified organic wild blueberry, seaweed farm, and orchard. Severine is one of my favorite speakers. She's an activist for promoting the values that we all share in the organic movement. She's hilarious, smart, and always entertaining. So please join us.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking today with Severine Von Tscharner Fleming, who is a farmer activist, organizer based in Downeast, Maine. She runs Smithereen Farm, certified by MOFGA, wild blueberry, seaweed, and orchard operation. She's also co-founder of the Young Farmers Coalition, and she runs the Greenhorns, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing young people into agriculture. So how did you get into farming in the first place?
Well, I grew up going to my mother's family's farm in Switzerland. And so was kind of with, barn kittens was, I think, my gateway drug into agriculture. And then in college, got involved in Southern California in what was previously the dumping ground of the college campus that I attended, which is called Pomona College. Pomona is, as you know, the Roman goddess of the orchard. And so we were planting an orchard in the kind of dump, green waste dump, and then just stayed in it from there. Went on to Northern California, Camp Joy, UC Berkeley, got a degree, focused in agroecology in the conservation department at UC Berkeley, and, followed the path. And then during college felt very much that we needed to create, really hospitable habitat for the incoming generation and recruit more young people and support the young people who are struggling with their entry. And so then that became kind of the last 15 years of organizing has been, celebrating and oxygenating the welcoming. And then, of course, that's grown into various projects and guidebooks and mixers and radio. And the documentary film was a early project, but now we're into online videos, and we have a literary journal that's in its 6th edition that has 100 contributors, so that we're kind of thinking together and celebrating together the work and the thinking that goes into the work for There's kittens in the background right now, actually.
Okay. And so out of that, you've done a lot of activism. You've done a lot of organizing of people. And right now you're organizing about seaweed. So honestly, when I first heard about it, it wasn't very interesting to me. And as I have listened more to you and Robin speaking, it got much more interesting. So tell me about what you're involved with in seaweed. Why are you involved? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say the seaweed has a magnetism that really grows on you. I first came to this part of the world here in 2015 and started wild harvesting with my friend Casey, and then worked as a helper to my friend Micah, and then worked with Andrea, so worked with other young seaweed harvesters, kind of learning the ropes and learning about boats and learning the different parts of the coast and the kind of cultural sphere, but also the ecological sphere of the seaweed world. And that magnetic pull of the seaweed, got me to commit to Washington County. We're actually the northeasternmost oyster lease in the United States by 2 hours drive. So we're pretty far out, and Cobscook Bay is a place where there is commercial harvest of rockweed. We have also seaweed aquaculture here, 2 different operations. And then I'm a wild harvester of seaweed to make value-added products. And then there's a man who harvests wild kelp beds and sells it on to another processor. So there's a few operations, but not that much, right where I am here in Maine.
Is all seaweed essentially wild harvested, or is there cultivated seaweed?
So there's one ocean. It's all connected, and all seaweed is growing in the ocean in the intertidal or in the subtidal, meaning when the tide comes up, it covers up all of the intertidal, and when it goes down, it exposes the intertidal. And when it's a super low tide, then it exposes even more species. And the seaweed species, of which there are many, basically are in a gradient up the slope in what they call the littoral zone. And so different ones that we harvest by hand for eating, like sea lettuce or dulse or alaria or saccharina or nori, they're on most of the ones that we're really interested for edible harvest are low in the subtidal zone, whereas what's harvested for fertilizer is rockweed. And rockweed is the predominant seaweed of the intertide, and it really is dominant in the seaweed ecology of Maine and really also into New Hampshire. So those, while we're all in the water, the operations are happening at really different sizes. We harvest in a little boat into little round bins, and we dry it in our greenhouse, like our tomato greenhouse. Around us in the bay, there's blue boats that are filling an entire boat that's going into a bag. And that rockweed is then being put on a barge with, 1,000 other bags. And those barges are going to New Brunswick to dry out on a big, it's actually a runway in New Brunswick where they dry the seaweed for fertilizer. So the scale of harvest of commercial fertilizer rockweed is about 20 million pounds a year, according to this data of the state in the state of Maine. And the scale of seaweed harvest for food is much, much smaller. I would say also that, we're making $40 a pound for a dried product, value-added sprinkle condiment, whereas the seaweed kelp that's used as a cattle feed or mostly as a fertilizer, that's $50 for a 50-pound bag at the end use. The harvester makes 4 cents a pound. So on a 6-hour-long tide, I can generate thousands of dollars of value, and they're, making like $200. So those are some of the kind of value and scale frames.
So,
but then we're not even talking about farm. That's all the wild part.
yes, I did work for some years on oysters and clams in the Puget Sound, and it was very similar. The clams were actually wild in the sense that they weren't being handled or anything, whereas the oysters were very much being farmed, and you'd put out shells for seed, and then you'd move them, and you kept moving them. I couldn't believe how many times we'd move them until finally we'd go out and harvest them when the tide was out, and there'd be a barge. So it was on the mud, and you'd harvest all of them, put them on the barge. The water would come in, and you'd pull the barge in to be processed. Is it like that with seaweed? Is there some of it that is farmed in the sense that humans plant it?
So in the last few years, especially, the seaweed farming has been growing in Maine and in other places. And there is increasingly a market for farmed seaweed, although the market isn't as big as sometimes the hype would lead you to think, because Americans are still getting 90+% of the seaweed that we eat from Asia. But there is more and more seaweed being grown, and it's being grown on lines that are suspended in the water column between buoys. The buoys or mooring balls are then attached with chain to either stone or concrete anchors or mooring balls. And those are then stable in the water column, and the seaweed is just growing all winter long. You put the seed in October, and then all winter long it's growing. And then in April, you come with a knife and you cut it off, and then you dry it. And that's the way that it's been farmed. So I think, a point to make for more terrestrial farmers is to say that just as on land, all agriculture is displacing wildland, so in sea, all aquaculture is displacing the wild ecosystem that was there before it. And somehow that's easier to feel at sea than on land, where we've been a domesticated place for longer, and we're inhabiting farms that have been domesticated before. That really, like, as a freshman class of seaweed farmers coming out into waters where seaweed aquaculture hasn't been ever, that we're basically like frontiers people, and we're out there in a wild system. And of course, it's not without impacts. Anything that you're doing that involves boats and motor oil and plastic and buoys and line and gear, obviously has an impact. And we're here in a place of extreme globally significant marine productivity, because we have these huge tides. We're this backsplash of the Bay of Fundy. We have cold water coming down from the current, the Labrador Current. We have the warm Gulf Stream coming up. So we have this amazing churning, that yielded the great cod stocks, the amazing herring, the alewives, the glass eels. Fully 10% of the residents of Washington County make their living through commercial fishing. We have the most diverse commercial fishing license holding of any county on the Atlantic seaboard, and we also have the highest percentage of our population making their living from the sea. So the abundance of this place is also the sustenance of this place, economically speaking. And we also are visited by, right whales, some of the last on Earth of this, majestic, massive whale. I think there's 420 individuals left, and some of them come and fatten up here at the mouth of our bay. And, a big thing that is endangering them, and the big conversation in fisheries in Maine, is the gear that they get tangled up in and die from is fishing gear and lobster gear, and and so aquaculture gear is also gear. And I think that's an important consideration to make.
Okay. So, yeah, this is great. So one of the things that we see is that when human activities get scaled up, they have a huge impact on the ecosystem. And fishing is a great example, because we have so reduced the number of fish in the sea that fishing is getting to be a more and more difficult profession economically. I'm curious about seaweed. When I became an organic farmer a long time ago, seaweed was one of those things that we saw as being so benign. It's like, oh, you should add seaweed. It's got great trace elements. Actually, I haven't used seaweed as a fertilizer in 40 years, but because for me, I didn't actually see the great response. So it just was another thing. But I never thought ill of it. It always seemed like a benign amendment. I think you're going to suggest that there's a more painful side to that.
Well, I think, I live down the road from Robin Seeley, who's a marine biologist and a really avid protector of the rockweed, and a watchdog of this mining of our intertidal ecosystem that's going on this, barge and boat scale with cranes removing, millions of pounds of living matter. And so as a student of hers, I asked, how much seaweed can I take for my gardens? And she said, well, go down to the beach and study who eats it and study what's going on. And when you feel like you know how much you can take, then you should take how much you can carry, but not really much more. And so that was a kind of a nice mentorship that I was lucky to have, because I happen to live right here, and I have actually a shorefront right here. And have also found a fleet of 8 boats of guys hacking away at the seaweed growing right here on my shore, where they didn't have permission to take from, and going down with my pitchfork and saying, that's the fertility that I need for my farm. You don't have permission. And what they said back, I cannot repeat on television, but there is a kind of an annihilatory culture that happens in these low value, high volume resource economies. And there's a very strong, we've been taking too much, let's just say it that way. And obviously, my orchard is planted here on land that was scraped by glaciers. We have very poor sandy soils here in Maine overall, especially at the end of a peninsula. I'm planted to have 400 fruit trees that have benefited tremendously from being fed with seaweed and dairy manure from our local, last in the county dairy farm, and wood chips from the forest. And so, the fertility of this farm is totally to do with the sea, and but also we see from here the impact that removal has on an ecosystem that supports 100 other species, and the volume of it, and the fact that it's being taken right off, illegally right off of federal wildlife refuges, right off of nature conservancy reserves. The high habitat value of this landscape is reflected in all the infrastructure bills that get passed for new roads and new fishways and increased fish passage and, improved culverts. And a lot of the jobs of this county are related to tax spending that acknowledges the habitat restoration that we can do here and where the fish will really rebound. And so, believing as I do that our mission as organic farmers is to be healers on this earth, I see that we have the same mission if we're in kind of conservation-minded aquaculture, to be healers rather than harmers, and that we need to be very precautionary about the way that we take from this ecosystem. And there are limits.
So can I ask, of course, any good person would care what happens in the coast of Maine, but let's say that I live in Ohio and I'm not very thoughtful about what's happening to people in Maine. Is there a way in which this actually might impact the lives of my children? What happens in Maine? In other words, is this part, in a meaningful way, is this part of a global climate system that, yes, what happens in Maine and what happens in the Amazon and what happens in the sub-Sahara, that these all affect us? Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we like to say is seaweed is already saving the world. That the carbon cycling of these algae forests, the very charismatic kelp forests on the Pacific side are these floating jungles. Our kelp forests, the equivalent is the Ascophyllum forest, and it looks a little different, much more shaggy, much more kind of like dreadlocks. That forest is photosynthesizing. That forest is turning the sun's energy into living carbon and then dissolving into the lowest trophic levels, nourishing the plankton and the phytoplankton, and nourishing, therefore, all of the crustaceans, all the shellfish, all the little arthropods, everybody, all the way up. And that trophic accumulation is essentially the living carbon of the ocean, including the bodies of the whales, and that actually the carbon sequestration conversation being conceived of in a mechanical way is unfortunate, because actually we can understand that life on Earth is living carbon. The best way to sequester carbon is in living ecosystems. The best way to hold carbon in the ocean is through living creatures. And that currently the ocean is buffering a tremendous amount of this excess carbon that's been let off by industrial civilization, and that algae is a big part of that. In evolutionary history, we know that algae was the first to photosynthesize, and that historical algae and contemporary algae created the atmosphere of oxygen that we breathe and, are the ancestors of all terrestrial life. And so they are very, very ancient creatures and systems. And that, especially as conversations start going into genetically engineered seaweeds, intensive and extensive, 1,000-acre or plus, seaweed farms and domestication of this algae, then you start having little red flags go off about, okay, let's be careful. This sounds a lot like the conversations about genetically engineered trees. And again, just because you're farming it doesn't mean it's not the wild. You're farming it in the wild, and you're displacing the other coastal inhabitants in so doing. So yeah, it has impact. I would say another one to consider is the nitrogen cycle overall that we on land and not only in the sea, but also in our rivers are confronting in this time is profoundly broken. And so the nitrogen I'm talking about in the sea is definitely using nutrient from the land to grow. But that most of our rivers, especially if you're talking about Ohio, or if you're talking about the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, even the Connecticut River, you're talking about an excess of nitrogen running off from our lawns, from our cities, from our agricultural fields, and really impacted waterways basically being the norm for, all American land stewardship. All coastal waterways are absorbing that nitrogen runoff. And the algae is there, you could say, as a helper, as an indicator of that overabundance of nitrogen. And then there are a lot of growing incidents that can be quite destructive for other life forms of algae blooms that occur around the world, occur routinely. have major economic consequence. The coast of Brittany is a recent example where there were deaths of children and animals from the seaweed billowing up and creating sulfuric acid cloud as it rotted. In Asia, there have been increasing algae blooms. There's just algae blooms, in most harbors that happen. Certainly the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and the eutrophication that we see at the mouth of the Chesapeake, etc. These are all out of balance nitrogen cycles. So, one of the conversations that we've started to have a lot with people who are marine biology types that get into seaweed and, want to be helpful in the world saving or in the world healing is how can we do our seaweed farming and, capture the benefits of seaweed for our land-based agriculture or for remediation, restoration of sites of extraction in places that have been herbicided and, places that have been degraded by mining or oil and gas extraction, et cetera. Like seaweed is a real amazing booster to those kinds of degraded systems, and degraded land is what we've got. So seaweed is going to be an ingredient that we will want from the world as we try to remediate more land. So then how do we get that seaweed not from a wild ecosystem? Can we get it by growing seaweed in these impacted rivers and harbors where human impacts are already quite significant?
Right.
And be using those kinds of algae instead?
So right now, what percentage of the harvest of seaweed, the non-edible seaweed, the seaweed that's being used as fertilizers or animal feed, what percentage of that is going to organic agriculture? Do you have any idea?
Oh, that's a good question for Robin. It's significant. Organic farms and dairy farms are significant users. Citrus growers use a lot of kelp, which is actually ascophyllum, for foliar spray, and growers, greenhouse growers and cannabis growers and, horticulture industry, nursery world, they use kelp. So, it's an input. It's a major input, and I don't think it has to not be allowed or stopped. But I definitely think that the case has been made now to the National Organic Standard Board that the current regulatory oversight of seaweed harvests is inadequate to ensure the sustainability of that harvest, and that an increased level of vigilance is needed to make sure that we're not taking too much.
Did that recommendation pass the NOSB, the National Organic Standards Board?
Yeah. So last October, right, 2 days before the election, the National Organic Standards Board voted 10-2 to say that every species of seaweed that's macroalgae that's harvested for use as an organic fertilizer should get an independent scientific oversight board to make sure that the bycatch, the volume, the regrowth, and the kind of habitat structure are having a chance to regrow before it's cut again. And so that's a major breakthrough because, the regulatory bodies are basically, underfunded, and they don't have that many boats, and there's no way they can really watch over the whole coastline. So they've just kind of been like, well, we can't do it, so we're not going to get involved. But so for the organic industry, the organic movement, for the organic oversight boards, bodies to, through a democratic process, study the evidence and listen to scientists and listen to indigenous peoples who've been concerned and who have been blocking seaweed harvest from their sovereign waters, and listen to the testimony of many, interested parties and say, yep, we also recognize that the demand for this is only going to go up. The demand for seaweed is only going to go up, and we need to be careful that we don't imperil the marine ecosystems that are so important for our climate's health and for our whole planet's health, just to get, trace minerals into these tomatoes that are grown in a greenhouse somewhere in Arizona or somewhere in southern Spain or somewhere in Israel, that the global supply chain problem that we have in agriculture overall is the same problem that we have for seaweed as a commodity, just the same as we have it.
Okay, good. So the recommendation passed in the National Organic Standards Board. Has the National Organic Program acted in any way on this?
Not yet, but there's a new piece of news that I should read. The National Organic Program, a National Organic Coalition, has a number of recommendations that they're pushing. And I bet you guys are involved in that too. Maybe you better tell me.
Well, I mean, what I do know is that there have been a lot of recommendations that have been ignored. And Organic Trade Association said there were 20 in 10 years. All of the recommendations had been ignored. So in 10-year period, 20 recommendations had not been acted on, starting with the prohibition of hydroponics certified as organic, and going up through many, many major issues in animal welfare and including making sure that they're not cycling conventional cows in to organic dairy. But so this would have been one of them. This would probably be number 22 or something. And there's a big effort, obviously, to turn that around. So far, it has not been successful. You've said something earlier that I thought was sort of inspired. It really landed on me, which is that bodies regulate themselves. Our bodies regulate themselves, and that there's a wisdom to that. That's how we thrive. And you seem to be, indicating that as a society, we also need to regulate ourselves. And of course, there are lots of ways in which we take that for granted. Speed limits and laws against abuse and stealing and all that stuff. So tell me what that kind of intelligent regulation might look like in this case.
Well, I think it's really kind of a test for this next phase of our democratic process, and as a incoming generation of advocates and citizens and people who live in places like I do, where we have industry operating in our waters, we have mining of the seaweed, and now we have a proposal for a Canadian company to come and mine silver right out of my watershed. What's cool about Maine is we can write an ordinance at the town level, and we can regulate that. The question for the larger system is, are we able to create constraints? Are we able to regulate and shape the size and scale and kind of operating conditions of the different sectors of our economy? So for seaweed or aquaculture, right now we have a bunch of smallish, locally owned oyster companies operating in Maine. And they make jobs, they make oysters, they clean the water. Yes, it's not completely harmless, but it's basically scale appropriate to the coast of Maine, compared to these, 8 new proposed salmon farms that insist that they need to have 1,000-acre leases, that they should be able to sell the leases one to the other, without it going back through public trust to the regulator, that it should be able to become private equity in the sea, is one of the major points of contention from a vision that I'm personally interested in of the management of our ocean commons. So, whether or not you have a regulatory agency that sets the parameters for the businesses that occupy the public trust would seem to be the defining feature of what occurs. So let me say that differently. If you make the rules such that only the big boys can make profit, then you will have only the big boys. If you make the rules scaled for with, where the people who have access to the public trust have adequate training, that the size and siting of those operations is conservation minded, that the operators are local, live here in Maine, another major control, that the seed, the genetic material that's being grown is native to the bay where it's being grown. Just right there, those just 4 little rules like that, all of a sudden you have a completely different shape of an economy that occurs here. And I think one that much more closely matches what people, here hope for in the way that the water is used. There's, but it's not always clear to us, I think, how to engage with our legislators, with our regulatory agencies in order to achieve that level of sensible oversight when the lobbyists, the industry captures the regulators and the regulators check the boxes, the permits get issued, and, they take what they want.
So it sounds to me like there are 2 things you're talking about that are connected but somewhat different. And one is basically that small is beautiful, and that a more decentralized local economy is going to benefit the people, right? That everyone has a somewhat better life if we have a bunch of small operations that are responsible to each other. The other one is that when we get these huge entities, that they start to control the regulatory process. And so the regulations themselves actually change. It's not scale neutral because the regulations favor the compromises of the large operations to make them more money. Did I get that right?
Yeah, well, it's a similar, I had a conversation 2 days ago with my friend Lindsay in Wisconsin, and she said, Smithfield is moving into Wisconsin and they're building CAFO pig operations, wall to wall, because they've basically run out of space in Iowa, and it's all being shipped off to China. It's a big stinking mess, and there's, it's not easy to stop them. And, that's essentially what we have going on here with fish. They're essentially CAFOs of salmon. And, what I've just said, 8 more proposed. Now, does that benefit this place? Not that much. And whereas if we had what we have in the world of oysters, where you have, 5 employees or 10 employees, with lines growing oysters that are serving the regional marketplace, well, that's a scale that's much more appropriate. I think the point is that you exclude the medium. It's not just that small is beautiful. I think we've proven ourselves very capable of creating luxury food economies living inside of the rest of our food economy. We're pretty good at 1%. But if we wanted medium small and smallish medium to be able to occur, then we do maybe need to confront the big and the giant and the gargantuan who are, operating with profligacy in what is our shared waters. And I think that's a major part of what makes it different on the sea and then on the land, is that these waters do belong to all of us. It is a commons. It is in the public trust. So it's, you could say it's a way to prototype some of the regulating that we need to do more on land. And some of the challenges to private property that we might realize soon that we will need to confront on land as we try to remediate and recover and respond to extreme climate change. We're going to have to be imposing more on everybody's, private property freedom to do as they like. And so I think maybe this is interesting in the way that it also helps us prototype that thinking.
So if there was a conversation with regulators and about how the commons would be managed, and even if we left scale out for a minute, if you put in the regulations you would like just in terms of protecting the environment, would that automatically reduce the scale?
Well, so would it automatically reduce the cost?
The scale, like would it stop favoring large operations?
Yeah, so we had, just in the phase of, so let me start again. So Seaweed Commons is a website, and it's a community, it's a learning community that's mostly made up of very passionate seaweed harvesters in a bunch of different countries who are in dialogue with one another about this rapid industrialization of the seaweed economy and about what they observe day to day. And and it has turned into a place where we are collecting information about how to involve ourselves in regulatory reform, because that's the place of intervention. And so within the Seaweed Commons community, we can really learn different things from different parts of the world where different parts of the problem kind of manifest themselves more strongly. And I could get into the specifics of that. But where we're leading to is a kind of a template approach to regulatory framing. And it's not that complicated. Is it locally owned? Is it suitably scaled and sited? Does it use native seed? And what was my last one? Oh, and then is there a size limit? And such that the operations that lease the public waters return them to public waters, and they have to be leased again by a new entity, not that they can just be sold and exist as private equity in the water. So just those 4 as a start already really constrain what becomes the standard of the industry. And even you don't have to use the word industry, you could use the word sector. But I think there's a very quick leap that's going on in aquaculture to talk about industry, and as industry as the only methodology for interacting with our ocean ignores this vast human experience of artisanal, peasant, coastal peoples interacting with mariculture and aquaculture using a huge diversity of materials, especially natural materials, to produce food, in cooperation with water. And so I think that's kind of the whole reason why the organic movement occurred on land. And it's just the kind of, as we intensify now our expectation from the sea and are starting to have a lot of interest in farming in the sea, it's not unexpected that you would have a bunch of pipsqueaks piping up saying, hey, we need an organic version of this. We need ecological aquaculture. We need aquaculture without plastic. We need aquaculture with native genetics. We need aquaculture that is respectful of the place where it's happening. And so I think that's the kind of reform movement that could use more voices and more organizational support, more of these coastal organizations, instead of just saying, yes, kelp, hype, that they would really accompany the regulatory process and accompany the training, because as a holder of a lease, I have to go and get a training every other year in order to have the right to operate in shared waters. And when that training occurs, we see a lot of slides about oyster diseases from the 80s. And then when we get to the seaweed part, they say, oh, well, we're still developing those slides. Listen, people, we're your freshman class. We need an orientation. We need to know about disease pressures that can come from our farmed algae and go off into the wild algae. The European regulators, they don't let farms into Irish waters unless it has a university affiliation, because they want a higher standard of marine literacy of anyone who's operating in public waters. In France, they've got really bad issues with nitrogen pollution from pig farm runoff. So they're sectored out and they do water testing, not just for oysters, but also for the algae, to be able to know, well, this wild seaweed was harvested in a place where, the nitrogen wasn't too high, et cetera, et cetera. So, other places confront these issues in a different order, But in the US, we're very much a Wild West. And I don't think that serves us. And I wish that we had more humans working in this area. So I guess I'd just say I offer Seaweed Commons as this learning place in the hope that more people would join into this work of proposing and enacting suitable structures to contain this next phase of our engagement with the ocean.
So at this point, would you consider the acupuncture point in this system to be training the wild harvesters, or would it be to train the consumers? Would it be to better inform the regulators? Where's the inflection point here? Where's the place where the whole system can be turned a bit?
I think informing consumers is always helpful in our economy, consumer economy. I think building a culture within those who are entering aquaculture, in the same way that young farmer culture and organic farmer culture helps motivate and bring animated curiosity to the continuing reform and continuing improvement and curiosity and experimentation, as exemplified by this very lively conversations about adaptive seed breeding and biochar and on-farm breeding breeding programs and SARE research projects, etc. You have a very lively innovation going on because you have so many highly motivated humans. And I feel like that would be a similar kind of a context to incite in the world of seaweed. I was at a meeting of the Seaweed Council and in Maine, and we were eating our haddock burgers, and we were talking about our festival and our fair, and some angry lawyers came huffing and puffing to join the meeting. They had driven all the way from Connecticut, and they immediately started speaking in loud voices about the lawsuit that they had put in against a nonprofit that was organized to support seaweed farming in Maine. And there was a lawsuit that was funded by a Google-backed venture company out of California, sending their Connecticut lawyers to our little meeting in Maine to try and basically control the supply chain for seaweed out of Maine. And, and I was there in this meeting, and I was the only aquaculturist at the meeting in that particular meeting. And it was my first season. And I just thought, gosh, here you have these guys from California and Connecticut coming in trying to control a supply chain of something that doesn't even really hardly exist yet. We can barely defend ourselves from this, and we're outgunned. So we better start building some cultural power and some shared vision about what we want to have happen in our waters and what we want to have happen with our seaweed economy if we want to make it a place of opportunity and prosperity and protagonism for young people. So the price per pound of the seaweed that's harvested in the Philippines and the seaweed that's harvested off the east coast of Africa and the seaweed that's harvested in the South Pacific, 25 cents per kilo dried to go into a global supply chain, to be processed into alginates and agar and carrageenan to go into food industry. I mean, we know very well that seaweed farming is not profitable for the small, marginalized coastal peoples whose fish have all been removed and who are left with, growing monocultures of gracilaria in their warming waters. So here we have the opportunity in Maine with our cold waters that are also warming to say, we'd like to get a viable price for this product. And we don't need to decide in the very, very, very beginning to just hand it over for bioplastics or bioethanol or fish, industrial fish food. We could build something looks a little bit more like a CSA, that looks a little more like cilantro, that looks like something with a price per pound that makes it worth getting out there. And already, you had people a couple years ago selling fresh kelp at farmers markets in Stonington for $9 per wet pound. The price that's being paid now in Maine by, some of the processors is 50 cents a pound. The price that the consumer pays for frozen wild blueberries is more like $8 a pound. The price as a producer of wild blueberries is 25 cents a pound. That is the problem. So if we want to operate inside a viable economy for a reasonably sized and scaled, where the operating system isn't degrading the earth, well, then we need to defend that. And I think that's what we're here to do.
Severine, before we go, can you share how people can contact you to learn more, to join in? Have you got a website?
Well, you're most welcome to come visit us in Maine. We have campsites, and we had 40 people sign up for the seaweed harvesting workshop that we had earlier this summer, and we'll continue to offer, hands-on coordinated love affair with the algal world and literacy training. And Seaweed Commons as a website exists for the purpose of inviting people into this discourse, which is, very, very slippery. And then we have done a bunch of recordings with Slowfish USA and Slowfish International. We're hoping very much to work with Real Organic Project and hopefully with MOFGA, who are here in Maine as certifiers of the seaweed operations here, to try and develop standards that are above the current regulatory framework that is inadequate. So that's kind of where this is headed from my end, is really practical on, and obviously we'd love more humans and more financial support to allow the organizations that we need to work with to get that to happen.
Yeah.
I get very serious. I feel very urgent about it. It's not as fun of a thing to talk about as I would like.
That's all right. It's a very interesting thing. So thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your work ongoing for years.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you will subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a rating and review. A video version of this interview, as well as the full transcript with links related to our conversation, is found at realorganicproject.org/episode 61. Please join us next time when our guest is Paul Muller of the legendary Full Belly Farm outside Sacramento, California. To find a Real Organic farm near you, visit realorganicproject.org/farms, and see you next time.